Leave your work at the doorstep. The job as a real estate agent will bring oneself in contact with some unusually constructed objects and mysterious old buildings from time to time. At the edge of the city, there was an old structure shrouded in mystery and rumors. It stood at the fringe of civilization, cloaked in shadows and secrets. Some said it was haunted, others whispered about strange rituals conducted within its walls. Few dared to venture inside, their curiosity overshadowed by a primal fear. And so, as the leading specialist for antique buildings at the company I am working for, it fell to me, Jonathan Gardner, to handle its assessment. My colleagues had long avoided this particular property, their avoidance a tacit acknowledgment of the building's unnerving reputation. Despite the hushed conversations and wary glances that greeted me when I mentioned it, I was driven by a mixture of professional duty and personal intrigue. The structure, known only as the Blackwood House, was a relic of a bygone era. Its dark stone facade, choked with ivy and grime, loomed against the overcast sky like a silent sentinel. The house's turrets and gables seemed to scrape at the heavens, while its myriad of windows, dark and vacant, stared back with a gaze that felt almost sentient. I parked my car on the gravel path, the crunching of stones beneath my tires the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. As I approached the entrance, the air grew colder, each step seeming to draw me further into a shroud of foreboding. The heavy front door, adorned with rusted ironwork, creaked open with an eerie reluctance. The interior was a cavernous expanse of shadows and dust, where the faintest sounds seemed amplified and distorted. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing intricate woodwork, ornate mouldings, and faded wallpaper that hinted at former grandeur. But there was an unsettling stillness to the place, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I could not shake the feeling of being watched, though the house was undeniably empty. My professional instincts told me to catalogue the building's condition and report my findings. Yet, as I ventured deeper, I couldn't help but sense that the Blackwood House harboured secrets far darker than any appraisal could uncover. Dust swirled around me like a living entity, choking off the faint light that filtered through the grimy windows. The air reeked of decay and forgotten dreams, thick with the oppressive scent of mould and mildew. Each breath felt laboured, as if the house itself were resisting my presence, trying to drive me away, or maybe further inside. As I ventured deeper, the whispers began. At first, they were merely the echoes of my own footsteps, distorted by the musty air. But soon, the murmurs took on a life of their own. They slithered through the hallways, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. I paused, straining to catch their elusive source. The fragmented phrases cut through the heavy silence, like jagged shards of glass. Get out while you still can. They're coming for you. The darkness will consume you. The whispers wove in and out of my consciousness, their voices layered with a palpable sense of dread. Shivers raced down my spine, my heartbeat quickening in response to the growing unease. My flashlight trembled in my hand, casting erratic beams that seemed to flicker and dance with a will of their own. The labyrinthine corridors stretched out before me, their twists and turns creating an endless maze that seemed to mock my attempts at navigation. Each step I took was met with a chorus of creaks and groans from the decaying structure. The floorboards protested under my weight, their mournful sounds resonating through the empty rooms. It was as if the house itself were alive, its very essence imbued with an ancient malevolence that sought to ensnare me. Shadows stretched and twisted, creating grotesque shapes on the walls that seemed to reach out, grasping for me. I moved forward, driven by a blend of professional curiosity and a growing, irrational fear. The whispers continued, their urgency increasing as if trying to communicate a message that I was not meant to understand. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down with a weight that was almost tangible. In one room, I discovered a set of old, tattered furniture covered in sheets. The dust lay thick upon them, disturbed only by my intruding presence. As I lifted one of the sheets, a rush of cold air met my face, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible scent of something long dead. My hand brushed against an old, leather-bound book lying atop a small table. It looked out of place among the otherwise unremarkable surroundings. The book was ancient, its cover cracked and faded, but something compelled me to open it. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, I found drawings, strange symbols and unsettling diagrams that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The more I examined them, the more the whispers grew frantic, their voices blending into a cacophony of desperate warnings. In the distance, I heard a low thud, like the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My pulse raced as I turned towards the noise, the oppressive darkness seeming to close in around me. The house was no longer just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, its very walls echoing with a dark and sinister presence. With a surge of sheer will and mounting fear, I pushed on, driven by a need to uncover the truth about the Blackwood house. But as I ventured deeper into the heart of the structure, the labyrinthine corridors and the disembodied whispers seemed to conspire against me, leading me ever closer to the very core of the darkness that lurked within. My flashlight beam danced across ancient symbols etched into the walls, their lines pulsating with an otherworldly energy. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of disembodied voices urging me onward towards some unseen goal. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation, and the chill in the corridors deepened. Curiosity overcame fear as I pushed open a rusted door, its hinges protesting with a shriek that echoed through the chamber beyond. What lay before me was a room that had been hidden from the world for decades. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dust-covered artifacts, their purpose lost to time. Ritualistic tools, daggers with intricate hilts, tarnished chalices, and cracked skulls, lay scattered amidst arcane texts bound in leather. In the center of the room, an empty stone pedestal stood, its surface adorned with cryptic runes that seemed to shift and writhe like living serpents. The pedestal's dark, polished surface was ready to hold some tome or artifact, as if it had been waiting for centuries for its moment of fulfillment. My gaze fell upon the book in my hand. It must have been there all along, taken with me in my distracted state, a relic of my exploration. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my eardrums like a heavy shroud. Suddenly, the air rippled, and reality itself seemed to warp and distort. Shadows coalesced into grotesque forms, their shapes flickering at the edges of my vision like distorted reflections in a warped mirror. In a trance-like state, I found myself drawn to the pedestal, my movements almost mechanical. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, the weight of my decision sinking in. With trembling hands, I placed the book on the pedestal. The moment it made contact, a shuddering wave of malevolent energy surged through the room, making the ground beneath me tremble. Ancient pages crackled open beneath my touch, revealing diagrams of eldritch creatures and invocations written in a language that seemed to writhe and slither off the pages. I began to read aloud the words of power, my voice echoing through the chamber. The shadows around me responded immediately, twisting and contorting into nightmarish shapes that loomed ever closer. The very air grew colder, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. The shadows' grotesque forms seemed to reach out, their intentions unmistakable and terrifying. As I continued to read, I realized too late the gravity of what I had unleashed. The whispers returned, now laced with mocking laughter, a sound that seemed to come from all around me. The voices spoke of my folly, their tone dripping with derision as they revelled in my helplessness. I tried to close the book, desperate to reverse the incantation, but my hands felt as though they were being held in place by an unseen force. My body, once my ally, now seemed to mock me, unresponsive to my frantic commands. It was too late. The ritual had been completed, and the shadows had already begun to coalesce into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pulsating with a dark, throbbing energy. The ancient powers I had invoked were now free, and there was no turning back. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of derisive voices celebrating the release of forces far beyond my control. As the room plunged into darkness, I felt the dark presence surrounding me, pressing in on all sides. My heart raced, and panic surged through me. The realization hit with brutal clarity. I had played the part of the fool, and now the price for my curiosity was about to be exacted. The chamber shuddered violently as the summoned entities materialized fully, their forms defying description. Tentacles lashed out, grasping at the air with an almost sentient malice, while eye stalks swiveled to fix upon me with unblinking, evil gazes. Each movement they made seemed to warp the very space around them, twisting reality into grotesque shapes. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling from the sheer wrongness of their existence. The creature's presence was like a blasphemous mockery of life itself. One of the entities spoke, its voice a grating rasp that echoed inside my skull like a relentless hammering. "Foolish mortal," it hissed, the sound vibrating through my bones. "You have called us forth, but you are not our master." The creature's appendages waved hypnotically, their movements almost rhythmic in their sinister intent. I felt my willpower fraying, unraveling under the assault of their dark influence. My breath came in ragged gasps as I desperately searched for an escape route, but the walls seemed to close in around me, the space growing tighter, more claustrophobic with every passing moment. It was as though the very architecture of the house was shifting to entrap me in this nightmarish realm. The creatures advanced with a chilling precision, their intentions clear and unmistakable. Panic seized me as I realized there was nowhere left to run. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and the entities surrounded me, their tentacles wrapping around my limbs with a cold, slimy grip. Their laughter reverberated through the chamber, a cacophony of malevolent glee that filled me with a profound sense of dread. Without warning, one of the entities extended a tentacle that morphed into a sickening parody of a human hand. It caressed my cheek with a touch that sent waves of revulsion coursing through my body, a feeling akin to icy, slimy fingers grazing my skin. "We shall take turns with you," it promised, its voice dripping with sadistic pleasure, "and you will learn the true meaning of suffering." The creature lifted me off the ground, its strength unervingly overpowering. I dangled there, held aloft as its brethren watched with grotesque fascination. My screams echoed through the chamber, a desperate, hopeless cry that seemed to dissolve into the oppressive darkness. I felt a cold, numbing despair as the creatures prepared to fulfill their horrific promise. Then, without warning, everything went black. I fell to the ground, my head hitting the hard stone floor with a bone-jarring impact. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented and confused, feeling the cold granite pressing against my back. The hammering pain in my head was intense, like a relentless drumbeat. Slowly, I regained my senses. The throbbing in my skull was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to move. Raising myself up from the ground, I looked around the chamber, expecting to see the horrific creatures that had moments ago held me captive. But the room was empty, save for the thick layer of undisturbed dust that covered everything. The pedestal in the center of the room was empty, its surface coated with a layer of dust untouched by recent disturbance. The ancient artifacts were gone, and there was no sign of the malevolent beings. I staggered to my feet, disoriented and trembling. I scanned the chamber, trying to piece together what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination? A trick played out in my head? Or had I somehow escaped the clutches of those nightmarish entities, waking up to find myself alone in this cursed place? I couldn't be sure. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, leaving me with a gnawing uncertainty. All I knew was that I needed to leave, to escape this house before whatever had happened to me occurred again. With shaking hands, I made my way out of the chamber, retracing my steps through the labyrinthine corridors. Each corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if the house itself were conspiring to keep me trapped within its grasp. The oppressive silence was almost as terrifying as the previous cacophony, and the shadows seemed to shift and whisper as if taunting my desperate escape. Finally, I reached the heavy front door. My fingers fumbled with the latch, and as the door creaked open, I stumbled out into the fresh air, gasping as if emerging from a suffocating nightmare. I turned to look back at the Blackwood house, its dark silhouette looming against the overcast sky. The whispers had faded, leaving only the echoes of my own frantic breaths and the sound of my pounding heart. I was sure I had narrowly escaped something far beyond my understanding. Heavily panting, I stumbled down the gravel road to my car, my legs barely able to carry me away from that cursed place. With trembling fingers, I fumbled for my keys, finally managing to start the engine. The car roared to life, and I drove down the dark, winding road, my gaze lingering on the shrinking silhouette of the house in the rearview mirror. It was as if I expected the house itself to rise up and follow me through the night, its malevolent presence chasing me even as I tried to escape. The journey home was a blur, the darkened road stretching on endlessly as my mind replayed the horrors I had just witnessed. The whispering shadows, the grotesque creatures, the ritual that had almost claimed my soul. It all swirled together in a chaotic, nightmarish haze. By the time I reached the familiar streets of my neighborhood, it was nearly midnight. The clock on the dashboard blinked the hour in a ghostly blue light. Still trembling, I parked the car and stumbled up the front steps to my house. My fingers fumbled with the key, and I pushed open the door, stepping into the comforting warmth of my home. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled me from my daze, and then I heard the familiar voice of my wife, filled with concern. "Darling, thank God you're home. It's close to midnight. What took you so long?" She stopped as the moonlight falling through the window illuminated my face, and her expression shifted to one of alarm. "God, honey, you're white as a sheet. Is everything okay?" "What's that?" she asked, her eyes widening as she noticed the object in my hand. I looked down, my heart freezing in my chest. There, clutched in my trembling hand, was the book, the old, evil tome from the Blackwood house. Its cracked leather cover felt warm and alive under my fingers, as if it had a pulse of its own. My breath caught in my throat as the realization dawned on me. I started to scream, the words tearing out of me in a frantic, desperate cry. I didn't take it with me. I didn't. My mind raced, panic clawing at the edges of my sanity. How could it be here? I had left it on the pedestal, or not? Had it somehow followed me, hitching a ride in my car, in my hand, all the way back to my home? The memories of the drive back became jumbled, distorted, like fragments of a dream slipping away upon waking. My wife's face turned pale, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at me, unsure whether to comfort me or recoil from the madness in my voice. "Jonathan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what is that? What happened at that house?" But I couldn't answer her. My mind was spiraling, trying to piece together the fragmented memories, trying to make sense of the impossible. The book felt heavier in my hand, as if it were anchoring me to something far darker than the terror I had experienced at the Blackwood house. I could feel its dark energy pulsing through me, seeping into my very being. In a sudden burst of panic, I hurled the book across the room, watching as it thudded against the wall and fell to the floor with a heavy, ominous sound. The silence that followed was suffocating, the air thick with tension. My wife's eyes darted between me and the book, her face etched with worry and fear. She reached out to comfort me, but our tension was abruptly interrupted by a soft voice that cut through the thick air of dread. "Mommy, Is Daddy home? You woke me up. What's going on? I turned, my heart sinking as I saw our little daughter standing in the doorway to the living room, her small figure illuminated by the dim light of the hallway. She stood there in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes sleepily, completely unaware of the terror that had taken hold of the house. "Everything is all right, sweetheart. Go back to bed," my wife said soothingly, her voice trembling as she moved toward our daughter, intending to scoop her up and carry her back to safety. But as our little one raised her arm, her sleepy eyes blinked open and her finger pointed past me into the corridor that led to the front door. "What is that, Daddy?" Slowly, my breath caught in my throat, I turned around, my body stiff with fear. The corridor behind me, which had been empty just moments before, was now swallowed by a growing darkness. It was a darkness unlike any I had ever seen. It was a living, breathing being. The shadows twisted and writhed, coiling like serpents, their tendrils reaching out hungrily. Paralyzed with fear, I watched as the darkness began to take shape. Black tendrils slithered across the floor, walls, and ceiling, spreading like a disease, their movements sinuous and deliberate. They crept closer, the sound of their movement like the rustling of dead leaves in a cold wind. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and rot, and I could hear the faint, mocking whispers, now louder, interwoven with cruel laughter that seemed to echo from every shadowed corner. I turned around to my wife and daughter with tears in my eyes. "Forgive me. I will always love you." My wife's breath hitched, and she clutched our daughter tightly to her chest. I wanted to move, to protect them, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. Tendrils lashed out, each one ending in a greedy, gaping mouth filled with glassy, needle-like teeth that glistened in the dim light. The mouths watered, drooling black ichor that hissed as it touched the floor. As the creatures fully manifested, their monstrous forms looming over us, the darkness twisting and writhing around them like a cloak, the mockery and laughter grew louder, and my family's screams mingled with my own, a chorus of despair that was drowned out by the darkness swallowing us whole. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the glow of those terrible eyes, red and yellow, burning with insatiable hunger. Soon nothing was left but an empty room, filled with the echoes of our final screams, lost to the nightmares that had followed me home from the old Blackwood house.